Hi, everybody. Dr. Jennifer Brout here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the motor basis of misophonia. I'm really happy that we're having this workshop, and this is a very exciting, game-changing paper, in my opinion. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Sukhbinder Kumar, who is a research fellow at Newcastle University. And some of you may know him, some of you may not. His areas of interest are emotion processing, interoception, and misophonia. And I would also like to introduce Mercedes Irfanian, who is a neuroscientist, and she is currently working at University College of London on a soundscape indices project, and her background is also in affective neuroscience rather, and clinical psychology. And with that, I am going to turn over the screen to Dr. Kumar, who is going to begin presenting his paper. Let me first say, if you would like to ask questions in the chat, if you see the chat button is at the bottom of your screen next to this big green sort of button that says share screen. Ask questions. Ask questions that, you know, if you're having trouble understanding anything and you want a clarification, feel free to ask. And both Mercedes and I are going to try to answer your questions. And if necessary, if everybody is not following, I will stop Dr. Kumar and ask him. And of course, if anybody has any issues with the sound or is triggered by anything, please do feel free to turn off your sound and follow along with just the slides. Okay, so all right, Sukhbinder, let's go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. And so I'll just start my slide. I hope so you can see my slides. Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, great. Okay.
There we go.
So yeah, can you see my slides now?
Yes, now
yes.
Okay. So there it is. I'll just move this one here. Right. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So the plan is I'm going to talk about the two studies that we have published, and I'll try to maybe put in a more simple words, just to make sure that everybody can understand it. But as Jennifer just mentioned, if there's any issue, please let Jennifer know, and I'm happy to explain that more. So I've given a title to my presentation as the brain basis for misophonia. So this is the outline of my presentation. So what I'll do is, so basically I had two publications. One was in 2017, and the other one just came out very recently in in the Journal of Neuroscience. So I'll just kind of put both these studies in context as to what each of these study means, and what are they kind of implying. And then I'll go on to the summary of findings from the most recent study. And then that will be kind of more data driven, but then I'll try to make a model or a theoretical principle. Well, principle is a strong word, but theoretical model on which we can understand misophonia, and that is the term is the mirroring one. So that is the name of the model we are calling as, which can explain misophonia. And then I'll also touch on what are the implications of the model, mostly scientific implications, and how can we understand misophonia. And then I'll have some discussion point and also see where we can take this work in the future. Right. So, so the first study that was published in 2017. So the idea of that study was to show brain and bodily changes in response to trigger sounds in misophonia. So in that study, what we did, we had 3 categories of sound. We have the trigger sound, typical eating sound, chewing sound. So these are the typical trigger sound. And we have the second category of sound called annoying sound, but they were not trigger sound. So the reason actually because we were told that that there is a difference between the typical annoyance that everybody feels when they hear any annoying sound, and they are very different from the trigger sound. So we just wanted to make a distinction in the brain response to the trigger and the annoying sound. And then we had the third category of neutral sound, neutral sound like sound of a rain, for example. So what we did, we measured the responses of the body, the physiological responses of the body, and also of the brain in response to these different categories of sound. So we had people with misophonia, and we also had a control participant who didn't have misophonia. So in the MRI scanner, so this was all done in the MRI scanner, we measured the brain activity using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we measured the heart rate. We also measured the galvanic skin response. So the galvanic skin response is, for example, when you are highly aroused, particularly with the negative emotion. It also comes with the positive emotions. So when you're highly aroused, your sweat glands start releasing more sweat. And just by attaching two kind of like electrodes on your finger, you can measure the galvanic skin response. And then we also measure like the brain activity using fMRI. So we had kind of both the body and the brain responses. So this is just the figure from my paper actually. So I'm showing you the changes in the heart rate. So so here on this axis is the time. So our sounds were like 15-second long. So 0 is when the sound comes on here, and here the time, here the sound offset. So so this is the top panel is for people with misophonia, and the bottom is controls, that is people without misophonia. And if you look at the red line here, red line shows change in the heart rate. So how your heart rate changes when the sound comes on. So the green one is for the unpleasant sound, that is the annoying sound, but not the trigger sound. And the blue one is the neutral sound. So as I said, this is for the misophonia, this is for controls. So you can see that the moment sound comes on, after like 2 seconds after that, the heart rate of the misophonia sufferer goes up, and it is continuously high as long as the sound is there. So there's a little bit blip here. This is when they press a button actually. So they just tell us how unpleasant the sound was. So that blip is because of the button press. So you can see that it is not happening for the annoying sound. It's not happening for the neutral sound. So this is the heart rate, and this is the galvanic skin response. That galvanic skin response is a very slow response. It takes long time to build up. So this is again the 0 is the time when the sound comes on. And again, the red line is for the trigger sound, and the other sounds are the unpleasant and the neutral sound. And you can see that again, this is higher as long as the sound is present. So that's kind of like a simple measure. You don't have to really go to the brain just to show that the trigger sounds are being treated as differently compared to the unpleasant and the neutral sounds. And you can see that in the control participant, they are not kind of, because these are all mixed up sound. So there's not much kind of difference happening in the control participants. Now that was the heart rate and the GSR. Then we looked at the brain activity. So again, we compared the brain activation of people with misophonia to the control participants. And we found that there was a area called anterior insula here. So just to orient you, this is the front of the brain. These are the eyes here. This is the back of the brain. this is this part of the lobe is just above your ears. Uh, and so this structure here is the anterior insula structure. So how does the activation of the anterior insula looks like in response to the three different categories of sound? So the different colors are for misophonia and control participants. The blue is for misophonia, red is for the controls. And these are the three different categories of sound: trigger sound, unpleasant, and neutral sound. So you can see that the activity of this structure for the trigger sound, for misophonia, it is much higher. The same sound when presented to the control participant, this structure is activated very less compared to misophonia participants. And if you look at the other two categories of sound, that the annoying or the unpleasant sound, it's not responding any different from control. So both the groups, both misophonia and with and without misophonia, they are basically showing very similar activation. And similarly for the neutral sound as well. So what it is showing is that the activation of the anterior insula, or the hyperactivation of the anterior insula, very much specifically for the trigger sound and not for the sounds in general. And again, we also showed very nicely that the activity of this structure correlates nicely with the misophonia rating. So we ask, after every sound, we ask them, okay, how misophonic distress this sound caused to you? So on a scale from 1 to 4. And this is kind of like the rating that is given by the participants, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the distress felt. And this is on the y-axis, the rating, is the activation of the anterior insula. So you can see it's almost very linearly increasing. There's nothing at rating of 1, which is kind of like a neutral sound, so there's no distress. And as the distress increases, its activity increases. So here actually we show very specific to the trigger sound what is happening in the brain and in the body. Okay, right. So basically, I would say that the first study, I mean, although we've made a little bit of conjectures, okay, why it could be happening, obviously, why the anterior insula is active, hyperactive in misophonia. So we made a few suggestions, but obviously the question was more of a validation of the subjective reports of the misophonic reaction, just to kind of convince the scientific community that, whatever subjective reports they tell us, okay, they feel like, moving away from the source of sound, all kind of this validated by showing some physiological changes in the body and in the brain responses. So I would say the first study was kind of more of validation of the subjective reports. So our findings have been replicated. So after this study was published in 2017, a group from Netherlands, Schroeder et al., they kind of use very similar paradigm. They use 3 categories of stimuli, but they use like video. I think they use video rather than just the sound. So they had video with sound, and then they kind of used the same paradigm, and they again found the anterior insula hyperactivation specifically to the trigger sound, and they also measure the heart rate. They also find the increase in heart rate and so on. So this study it was replicated 2 years after it was published. But as I said, the question of why remain. I mean, you can ask the question, okay, people are feeling the distress. You can see the physiological responses of the brain and the body, but then why it is happening? And I think that question remains unanswered. And I think the most kind of recent study that's published a month ago, that kind of takes a step in this direction as to why it could be happening, or what is the theoretical principle underlying these activations. Okay, so I'll go on to the second study now. So in this study, although there's a lot of data in this study actually, but I kind of like to make the thing simple. I would say that there are 2 major findings of this study. So one is called resting state connectivity, I'll explain in a minute what does it mean. And then the response to sound. So I'm dividing my kind of data in two categories, resting state and the response to sound. So what do we mean by resting state? So in the resting state, what we do is we measure the brain activity, but we don't play any sound or any other specific stimulus. So basically, it's the simplest experiment you can do. Subjects are, in a MRI scanner, or they are doing like, you can have other brain measurement, EEG or MEG or whatever. But in this case, it was fMRI. So it was an MRI scanner. So what they're doing is simply just lying inside the MRI scanner. We asked them, it's a little bit cool environment inside. People tend to fall asleep because they don't have anything to do there. So subjects, we just encourage them, okay, be awake, keep your eyes open, don't do anything. Obviously, it's very difficult for them not to think about anything. So they obviously, but we don't constrain them as long as they're lying still inside the MRI scanner and they are kind of like following the instruction of keeping their eyes open. We just kind of monitor their eyes by some camera from outside, but that's all we do. It's a very simple experiment. So for 10 minutes, they're just lying inside the MRI scanner, doing nothing, and we just measure their so-called resting state brain activity. So what we did with the resting state. So the idea of the resting state was, so it's a little bit of a, because normally when we say we are in a resting state, our brain is not, so some people might think our brain is not active, but it's not. Our brain is always active, even including sleep. So the idea is that in the resting state, our brain activity is fluctuating, right? It's fluctuating, not very randomly. There's a pattern to it. So it's fluctuating. And whether, so the idea would be that people with misophonia, whether there is some systematic pattern of that fluctuation, even when they are not listening to sound at all. And whether that pattern of fluctuation of this activity is different when we compare it to people without misophonia. So the idea would be that because when we listen to it, normally we think that our percept, if I feel some stimulus is bad, I feel that, okay, it is just the stimulus that has caused me. But before the stimulus, there are lots of things that goes on in your brain. What the state of your brain was just before the stimulus, that also decide how you are going to feel the stimulus. So in a way, it's not everything just stimulus driven. There are lots of things that you can understand even when the stimulus is not there. So that's the whole kind of general idea of the resting state. And it has been used in, as I said, number of disorders. And it's a very active area of research, trying to understand what are the patterns underlying the resting state. So that's what we did actually in this study. So okay, once we got the data, so the idea, so where to start now? Now, think it in a logical way, because we know that the trigger starts from a sound. That's what we understand misophonia to be. So the idea would be that if we look at the auditory part of the brain, if you look at that fluctuation in the auditory part of the brain, whether that auditory part of the brain where all the sound first of all come in, whether that has a stronger connectivity. So connectivity in a more functional sense. So when I say connectivity means, for example, so you might think of like two areas, because remember there's no stimulus being played. So in like two areas, both of them are fluctuating randomly. So there is no relation between them, although both of them are fluctuating quite randomly. So there is no correlation between their fluctuation. But you can also have a situation where there's an area sitting far away. The fluctuation of that area is correlated with the fluctuation that is happening in a different area. So you can have like auditory fluctuations, or you can have some other frontal areas that's also fluctuating, but either they could be correlated fluctuations or those fluctuations may not be correlated. So that's what I mean by connectivity. Connectivity means, is there any relationship between the fluctuations that are happening in different parts of the brain? So our obviously the target was because the things start from the auditory cortex. So we just wanted to check whether the fluctuations in the auditory part of the brain have any systematic correlation with fluctuation in any part of any of the rest of the brain. So we looked at the whole brain rather than just constraining ourselves to certain part of the brain. So are there any systematic correlations or systematic fluctuations that are correlated with the auditory part of the brain? So, and we picked up, we call it as a seed region. So it's like, you put a seed in one region and then you see where its branches are going to all the brain, right? So if there is a systematic correlation in some part of the brain, that branch would be significant, others won't be significant. So starting from one region and then you look at the rest of the brain. So that's why we call it as a seed region. So we took auditory cortex as the first, our seed region. Okay, so I thought actually maybe before I just keep on talking about auditory cortex, motor cortex, maybe some of you might have some background in neuroscience or you might have some understanding about brain, but I thought maybe I can give a little primer or a little tour about the different areas of the brain. So this is these are the three different ways you can look at the brain. So you can follow my cursor. So this is looking at brain from the sideways, from the side, like from your ear side, basically. So we call them as sagittal. A name doesn't matter, but this is looking from the side. This is kind of looking kind of more from the cross-section point of view. So imagine my brain here, and if you just start, slicing it, like from going from the front to the back, right? So, so this is the slice basically shown from the cross-section point of view. And this is the slice from the horizontal point of view. So if you basically take the slices going horizontally rather than just vertically, this one. So these are kind of three different orientations by which you can visualize. So where is the auditory part of the brain? So as I said, this is from the sideways. So just imagine above your ears, So this is a part of the brain here. There's a little bump you see here. And that bump, when you look it into different, is visible here, this bump here. And if you look in the horizontal, or this kind of looks at as a gyrus over here. So you can look on three different sections. So this is where it is just above the ears, as you might expect them. All the sound, first of all, basically that is their primary station. All the sound first of all come over here, and then they go wherever they need to go. But that is where they all come together. So that's why this is called auditory cortex. Some of it's called primary. Said there are different divisions of it, but let's just call them as auditory part of the brain or auditory cortex. If you look at the backside is where the visual information reaches. So quite a big area where visual information reaches. And then if you just this is the again, this is the front part of the brain here, and this is your front part, and this is the frontal lobe over here. So somewhere, kind of like if you go about 2/3 from the front to the back, you will see the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is which kind of control your actions. So if you want to make a movement of your mouth, or if you want to make a movement of your hand, then basically this part of the brain would be active. And interestingly, this motor cortex is localized in a way. If you want to do a hand action would be like, so this is like bottom, this is top of the brain here. So if it's a hand related action, it will be like at the very top, that will be kind of hand related action. But if you're doing like a mouth related action, it will be a little bit lower if you have to come down a little over here. So you'll see the mouth action. So when you're moving your mouth or you're doing any mouth related action, then you will see activation in a slightly different part of the brain compared to the hand area. So what I'm saying is that there is a different topography kind of representation depending upon what body part you are moving actually. So that's a little primer actually of that one. So what we found, coming back to the resting state connectivity. So what did we found? As I said, we took auditory cortex as our seed region and looked at whole of the brain where it had any stronger connectivity. And there was only one part of the whole brain where we found that the auditory cortex had stronger connectivity, or you can say the fluctuation there was systematically varying with the auditory cortex, and that was in the motor cortex. Nowhere else in the brain we found that there was any significant connectivity of the auditory cortex to motor. Remember, this is all compared between misophonia and non-misophonia. So compared to controls, there was one part of the brain where in people with misophonia, there was a stronger connectivity of the auditory cortex to the motor cortex. And which part of the motor cortex it was? It was basically in the lower side of the motor cortex. And that part is basically, as I said, it's involved in the mouth, orofacial muscle movement. So that was the only part we found a stronger connectivity. So that was for the auditory cortex. Okay, so I'm showing actually, I put rather than my journal figures, I just kind of made them a little bit simpler here because that figure is quite compact there. So basically here, so you remember this is the auditory part of the brain, right? This is the auditory cortex. So this is the region in the red is what we chose. We chose that as a seed region. And then we had basically looked at everywhere else. So where it had stronger connectivity is this is the motor part, if you remember from that one. This is the motor cortex over here. It's not kind of at the very top, it's kind of more toward the lower side. You can see that very clearly here. This is the top part, and this is the kind of more down part. So it's not in the top part where the hand related areas are, or your trunk related areas are, but this is kind of more in the lower part where mouth, your tongue, all these kind of representations are actually in the lower part. So that's the only kind of, we call them as a blob. That's the only blob that had a significant correlation. So don't worry about the name. This is called planum temporale, which is the part of the auditory cortex that we looked at. But this is a part of the auditory cortex, and this is the motor cortex that we looked at significant connectivity here. Right. So that was for the auditory part of the brain. Then we looked at, okay, well, that's fine, but then we know that they're also triggered by the image of somebody chewing or eating, right? So it's not just the sound. So could then it also be happening to the visual part of the brain? And then obviously visual is not, because I work in auditory lab, so we normally look at the auditory part of the brain more. But then we looked at, okay, let's look at the visual cortex. So now then we took visual cortex as a seed region. And then again looked at, okay, where in the whole brain, where does it have any stronger connectivity? And interestingly, the branch of the visual cortex, that is the connection of the visual cortex, also lands up in the motor cortex. And it's almost about 10 millimeters away. If you look at where the auditory cortex landed up and where the visual cortex landed up, those two blobs, if you look at their center, they're just 10 millimeters, that is 1 centimeter away from each other. So they're pretty close to each other. Both of them are in the lower part where the mouth action motor area is, and they are pretty close to each other. So that kind of like further reinforced that, okay, it's the motor cortex that is kind of playing a very critical role in misophonia. So I've just kind of again represented here. This is the back of the brain, visual cortex. That's what we chose as a seed region, and it lands up again in the motor cortex, again in the lower part of the motor cortex, where and we also did a lot of controls. For example, we did further analysis just to check, okay, whether the top part could be involved in some way, but we didn't find any evidence at all for any other part of the motor cortex involved compared to this part of the motor cortex. Right. But then, well, you can say, well, this was all about resting state. When they're not doing anything, how can you be sure that they have relevance to trigger sound? Because that's what the key question is. So resting state can give some idea. And as I said, the resting state connectivity does play a role in your behavioral. So depending upon what kind of patterns you have in your resting state, we know that lots of studies showing they have correlates with how you behave or how you perceive a given stimulus. So that is there. But obviously we wanted a direct evidence as to how this area, the motor cortex, let's call it orofacial motor area, it's a bit long name, but the motor area which is involved in orofacial movement of your the movement of the muscles of the face. So, but how it could it also be relevant for sound perception, right? Remember, it's a motor area. Motor area is normally involved when we are doing action, right, rather than perception of sound. Because when you say sound perceiving, auditory part of the brain should be lighting up. But then motor part, how it could be relevant for perceiving the sound or perception of the sound. So that's what we look in the second part. So that was my first part of the resting state connectivity. So the second part was basically response to sounds. So how does this orofacial motor area, which we've found in the resting state, how does it respond to sound? So again, in this picture, what you see is that area which we found before in the resting state. And we looked at how does it respond to the three different categories of sound, right? And in the panel here, I'm showing the response of this motor area to the three different categories of sound. And you can see that the pattern is very similar to what we saw before, but that was in anterior insula, right? You can see that trigger sound, so the red one is misophonia here. Trigger sound activate this orofacial motor area much more compared to the activation of the area in control participant. But as far as this activation to the other category of sound is there, it is not different from control, right? So, so the aversive sound, which are not trigger sound, both controls and misophonia, they respond equally. And for the neutral sound. So again, this area seems to be caring for the trigger sound and in people with misophonia, kind of more specifically activated by the trigger sound. So that's interesting because motor cortex being driven by the trigger sound. And this is kind of much more even clear in this figure here. And it's very similar to the rating. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the distress rating. So we found like how effective the sound was in triggering the mesophonic reaction. And if you just get the activation here, and you can see that in people with misophonia, so when the rating is 1, both the controls and the misophonia are responding equally well. But the moment kind of the mesophonic distress become high, it goes from 1 to 4, its activation of the orofacial motor area changes quite rapidly. It just it goes up to rating 2 and then kind of keep on increasing up to rating of 4. But for people, controls, there's a mild increase actually. There's a little bit of increase, but very mild increase in people without misophonia. So that kind of saying that here, so this area is not only connected strongly to the auditory cortex in the resting state, but it also has implications the way it responds to sound. It is specifically responding to sound, trigger sound in people with misophonia. Now, the most interesting part that we found, okay, motor cortex is responding differently to trigger sound. But what is happening in the auditory cortex then? Is the auditory cortex responding, because that's where all the sound first reaches. Is the auditory cortex responding any differently to the trigger sound? And to our surprise, there was no different. So this is just a horizontal slice, and I'm showing you two different part of the auditory cortex. This is the auditory cortex. That's the bump here, which I was referring to before. This is so the color white color is called Herschel gyrus. forget, you don't need to worry about name. It's called primary auditory cortex, where everything first of all comes up, and the black is a little bit higher order, where it's like a secondary auditory cortex. So we plotted the activity of both these areas marked in white and black. So on this side is the areas marked in white. So this is the area marked in white here. This is the area marked in. So this is on the left side of the brain. This is on the right side of the brain. So you can see that if you look at this area, which is called the primary auditory cortex, for the trigger sound, both the groups, the colors are exactly the same. So the red one is misophonia, the blue one, oh yeah, it's here actually, yeah. So misophonia and control. So basically, the sounds are not showing any difference. So the misophonia and people with and without misophonia are not showing any distinction in their activation as far as the auditory cortex is concerned. And aversive sounds are again very similar. So you can see that the difference, you can see very clear difference what is happening in the motor cortex and what is happening in the auditory part of the brain. So that is kind of like, it is giving us a message here that as far as the auditory part of the brain is concerned, there is no difference. It's not responding any different to trigger sound. It's not even responding any different to people in misophonia and without misophonia. Okay, so that is kind of the data. I mean, there's other data in the paper, but I think this is the kind of data in a nutshell. That the motor cortex is, so two messages. One is resting state, higher connectivity of the auditory to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex responding much more strongly to the trigger sound, and that difference, we don't see anything in the auditory cortex. So one conclusion I think you can immediately draw, if, for example, if you think that misophonia is a sound-related disorder, well, the auditory cortex is not showing any difference, right? So I think one thing you can rule out is that it is not a disorder of maybe sound related process. Sound could have a role. It doesn't mean sound does not have a role, but just limiting it to sound, that does not kind of fit well with the data that we have. So it's more than sound. So sound is playing a role, but specifically it's not just restricted to sound. So I think probably that's kind of, you can take the data and can start ruling out one by one what misophonia could be and start building a model or a theory around it actually. And that's what basically what I'm doing is, okay, this is the data now, and based on the data you can start building a model and how you make sense of it, and can we build a theoretical model which can generate some more hypotheses which can be tested and so on. So making sense of the data, mirroring model of the misophonia. So just to say, trigger sound activate motor cortex, and that motor cortex, as I said, is specific part of the motor cortex, which is involved in planning and control of mouth and facial movement. So basically what it is happening is that the trigger sounds are activating the action related areas. So what we are calling it is called the mirroring of the action of the trigger person, because they are activating, because when the trigger person is generating the sound, obviously he or she is using the motor part of the brain to generate the sound, because he or she is making mouth movement, right? But then the sounds are generated, sound then goes to the misophonia sufferer. And via the sound, although the misophonia sufferer is not doing any action, but when he or she listen to those sounds are activating the same part of the motor cortex which were used by the trigger person to generate those sounds. So in a way, sounds are acting as a medium, where they are kind of like going via the auditory part of the brain and activating the motor cortex, and that to very specific part of the motor cortex. So we call this as a mirroring of the action of the person which is responsible for generating the sound, right? Those sound then activate the action related part. So the idea is that just by hearing the sound of action or sight, or you see some action happening, it activates the action related brain area. So you are not doing actively any action, but you're just watching the action happening, or some movement happening. So this is called mirroring of the action. So the part of the motor cortex which will be used when we do the action, right? So whatever part of the motor cortex, when we want to do the action, uh, which will be used when we do the action ourselves, is activated just by watching or hearing the sound of the action done by others. I probably try to explain, because I think there's a little bit of technical part here, and I hope I'm able to explain to everybody now. But the thing is, this is called mirroring, but you might think that, okay, this is something strange, right? Happening in misophonia, but it's not strange. We know that mirroring is common and occurs in all of us. So if you watch somebody doing some action, hand action, mouth action, and if you were to monitor your motor cortex activity, you will see activity in your motor cortex, in exactly the same part of the motor cortex which the other person who is doing the action is using that one. So mirroring does happen, it's common. And so probably, maybe some of you know the discovery of mirror neurons. It was discovered in 1990s in monkeys. So it was discovered accidentally. They were recording from the motor cortex, and they asked the monkey to do an action, like a hand action. Pick up a nut, for example. So when the monkey was picking up the nut, some neuron fired in the motor cortex of the monkey. But interestingly, accidentally, a researcher came and picked up the nut instead of the monkey picking up the nut. And they've also found the same neuron, which was active when the monkey was doing the action, just by watching the researcher picking up the nut, the same neuron fired. Monkey was not doing the action, just watching the action. So, but then actually that was, done in 1990s, and then obviously there's a lot of work in animals looking at the mirror neuron system. In humans, there's evidence, obviously, because in humans we can't record directly from neuron, because you need a invasive recording, right? You have to record from a single neuron. You have to kind of insert electrode inside the brain and record at a very single cellular level, which we don't do that, because we normally use fMRI, which is like a bit of a very coarse method, very, what I would say, very, it averages out lots of activity of lots of neurons. So we can't look at single neuron. But there are like a couple of rare studies people have used, like epileptic patient, they insert electrode inside the brain, and they have been able to record some neuron activity firing in just by watching the action. So in human, there's evidence for mirroring. But as I said, since we can't record directly from a single neuron, the evidence is a little bit of indirect, because we are not recording, we are recording lots and lots of neurons together. So as I said, mirroring is not something which is uncommon. It happens in all of us. But in misophonia, as I said, we had a control group. It happens to a greater extent. So it is the same process which happens in all of us. It's just a scaled up version. And that's why, if you read my paper, we just coined the term called hyper mirroring, because mirroring is common. It happens in all of us. So it's a little bit higher in misophonia. So that's the kind of other thing we find, that misophonia, rather than looking at it in a little bit more abstract or any different way, we are kind of grounding it in our day-to-day perception, day-to-day things that happen. It just gets a little bit more scaled up version of that one, basically. Okay. But the question, I think, and people ask me actually, and I get like emails, and well, if the motor cortex is activated by a trigger sound, then why the misophonia sufferers do not repeat the action, right? So they should be just doing, because it's activated, right? So they should do the action. Now, just to kind of explain this one, this is a very important point to be explained. We need to make a distinction between the primary and the premotor cortex. Okay, let me just take you back to the primer that I have actually here. Okay, here. Okay, so let's just look at the motor cortex. So motor cortex is very big, right? I've just given a single name. It's a huge, motor cortex is really big. So there are different parts of the motor cortex. So one is this part of the motor cortex here. If, for example, if you just pass a electric current, you just take electric current and stimulate, say the top part here in the top part, and you will see like your hand may be twitching, right? Your hand will immediately twitch. So when you stimulate this top part here, uh, action will directly happen. Without you will not have any control over it. So when you just pass the current, you will see the action happening immediately. Stimulate this part here, which is in the lower part. This is the mouth related area. You stimulate that one and you'll see some tingling sensation in your mouth, right? Or but as I said, the motor cortex, this is called primary motor cortex. If you come a little bit front side, if you come to the front side over here, so rather than stimulating here, if I stimulate you here, which is a little bit more front side, this is called premotor rather than primary motor. This is called premotor area. Interestingly, when you stimulate that one, you will see that you will feel that, okay, I feel like moving my mouth, right? But the action will not happen. So that's the kind of difference between the primary motor and premotor. So there you might feel, I don't know why it's like, for example, when it is done in patient. So if you just stimulate that part, you'll say, it's a very weird sensation, but I feel like moving my mouth, right? But it's not like they are moving the mouth, but they get this feeling that I should start moving my mouth. So there's a difference between the primary motor and premotor. And interestingly, the mirror system is not not in the primary motor, but in the premotor. So it's kind of more in the front side, in this side here. So when this is activated, it does not mean that the action will happen, but you might have some sort of like unconscious feeling or something like you would like to do that action, right? You feel like if it depends on the stimulation and the current, sometime action might happen, or as I said, it's not. But if you stimulate the primary motor, action will directly happen. There is no doubt about that. But this mirror system, which is in the more front side, that is kind of more feeling like, and that feeling may not be even you may not be able to consciously access that feeling actually sometimes. So that's kind of the difference between these two. So when we are saying that this motor cortex is activated, sorry, where I was, here. So stimulate. So make a distinction between primary and the premotor. So stimulation of the primary motor cortex, action always happens. But if you stimulate the premotor cortex, it's like a feeling like doing the action, but action may not always happen. But there is kind of something like going on in the background. So mirror system is mostly in the premotor area because, I use the word mostly here, I'm being cautious, because there are some studies that shows in the primary motor as well, in the primary motor area, but it's a little bit controversial. But if you look at the monkey, for example, in the monkey, the mirror system is in the premotor, not in the primary motor, right? So they're all in the premotor areas where it's more of not kind of directly executing, but kind of more like a feeling of the action needs to be done. But interestingly, and that kind of like also one of the model that we are proposing, in some software, action directly happens. Actually, action does happen because some people, and actually the number is about 50, because I ran a study with my undergraduate student. She collected data from about 800 participants, and she found that about 60% of the misophonia sufferer, you can call them on a scale, they tend to mimic the sound or the action of the trigger person. right? So when they see, the eating, chewing sound, they just start repeating it. So either they do it deliberately or even just spontaneously. They without any control, they just start doing that. So it's not like action does not happen. Action does happen. Mimicking is a strong phenomena in misophonia. And I said it may not happen. That is also consistent with our consistent with the model that we are proposing. Right. So, well, that's all mirroring and action and motor area, but where does the emotion come in here, right? So why they get really such a strong negative emotional response? So how do we explain, how does the model then explain the emotional responses? So now you can see, so mirroring, if you take, or hyper mirroring, if you want to call it, so the mirroring of action is more than a simple perception of sound, right? It's definitely much more. It really goes into your motor areas, and motor areas normally are under our control, right? Normally we feel, okay, if I want to move my hand, I should be in charge of moving my hand, right? But here is like, the sound are driving that part of the brain, right, directly, without you being under control in a way, because it's just being stimulated. It's like somebody just kind of taking charge of your motor area in a way. I mean, it's a little bit more rough way of saying that, but that's how it is, because your motor areas are directly being activated, which kind of we normally do it ourselves. We are under control. So you can see that although action may not happen, but it kind of like start interfering with what you're doing, right? Because it is activating a certain part of your motor cortex, and then it starts interfering with whatever action you are currently doing, right? And I said, it might, you might be just forced to pay attention, that okay, what has really happened here? It is such a significant thing. I should be paying attention to it. So it can draw your attention very strongly. Um, so specifically, the sound may seem to be, it just kind of like violates you more, because it goes beyond the simple auditory perception. So sound may seem to be violating or penetrating the personal space of your body, actually. So that is why we think that, we need to look at the body and the motor part of the kind of system to understand kind of misophonia in a more holistic sense. And you can see that anger, because anger is interestingly, I mean, there are studies, and Mercedes probably has maybe knows more data than me actually. I mean, you find that at least because we published it, like it was a small study in 2014 where we kind of data, but the anger is kind of like the dominating emotion, right? In misophonia. So there are also other emotion like disgust also is there to some extent. There's also anxiety and kind of other, but anger seems to be kind of at least the topmost, one of the topmost kind of emotion. And then you can see that if you think that anger comes when something interferes in what you are currently doing. A very simple definition of anger. I know it's much more kind of technical than that, but if you just think, if you conceptualize anger as interference in whatever action I'm doing, and something is interfering in my action, so that can give rise to anger. So that interference underlies the emotion of anger. That's what we feel, that anger comes from that interference. And you can understand why mimicking happen. One thing is, okay, it is being driven directly, but you can also see that, okay, if I become a charge of that, right, I start doing the action myself, I become charge of my own action, right? So in a way, I regain control of my motor area by mimicking the action of the trigger person. So in a way, it kind of like puts a little bit of a control in a way onto what is being driven unconsciously out of your control. So mimicking can be understood in that sense. I mean, there are a number of ways to understand it. It can provide you relief because now you control it, and rather than being driven from outside. Uh, and actually, if you look at my paper, actually, now you might think that, okay, if this mimicking or the mirroring is underlying emotions, because my first paper was all related to emotion related areas like anterior insula and so on, right? So, you might say that, okay, well, where is anterior insula coming here, right? Um, uh, Interestingly, if you look at my figure 1 of my paper, we also showed that this orofacial motor area has a stronger connectivity to anterior insula in people with misophonia compared to control. So whatever activation in the resting state again. So we also did that one where we took the orofacial motor area itself as a seed region. And interestingly, we found anterior insula coming up, the one that we showed in 2017 paper. So that is kind of like giving a hint that whatever anterior insula we saw in our first paper, maybe underlying that was this mirroring or orofacial motor. So that kind of puts a um, further kind of like confidence in our model, because whatever we have seen before in 2017, that is coming up even in the resting state. So there is some evidence, as I said, so the evidence that the orofacial motor area shows higher resting connectivity to anterior insula, which is a emotion processing center. And we know that anterior insula is a very key structure in the mesophonic response. It correlates nicely with the mesophonic distress and so on. So that kind of like tells us that, okay, mirroring is the fundamental mechanism that is happening and driving whole of your emotional responses. So that is the kind of like idea behind putting that as a more fundamental mechanism. Okay, I'm coming to the implications of the model. What are the implications? As I said, probably I don't have much of clinical training. I would kind of stick maybe more to the scientific implications of the model. And obviously it has clinical implication as well. So one thing is that I think we are strongly, and I think we were very specific in our paper that misophonia has to go beyond sound, right? So misophonia, the name itself doesn't convey what it is causing. So misophonia has been seen as a disorder of sound emotion. In fact, you can also call us guilty, because in my 2014 paper we put misophonia disorder of sound emotion processing. Well, that was a kind of beginning, but I think based on this data, we strongly arguing that it's more than sound. So misophonia, our data suggests that auditory cortex activity in misophonia is no different from control. So, and therefore misophonia is not a sound emotion processing disorder per se. I should add the word per se, because obviously sound has a role to play, but they are acting like as a role of a medium, basically. But it's more than that. And as I said, because when we were taking misophonia as a sound disorder, it's kind of like cutting the rest of the part, because there is also, it's not like any sound triggering the misophonic reaction. It's there's a person producing sound, and also sometime when it starts, there's a specific person. So there's more than a sound going on. And kind of like if you take the holistic view, where the person is also in the picture, that puts misophonia in a more social aspect. So I emphasize the social aspect of the perceived emotion, that emotion cannot be different from the social aspect of it. You can't just separate it out. So it kind of put the whole thing in totality. The person, the social aspect is also important. And then we also mentioned, actually, in our discussion that it should be understood more within a social cognition framework, how we understand other people, for example. And listening to sound, any sound versus sound coming from a person is different, right? Because the social angle added to it. So that's why we said that it should be understood within a social cognition framework rather than the auditory perception. Because in the auditory world, normally we don't go to the social level. We just kind of constrain ourselves to the sound. And I think like any good scientific model, well, we'll say our model is a good model. It also makes prediction. Well, prediction is that, well, if you can reduce the mirroring activity in misophonia, that should reduce misophonia symptoms. So if we can reduce the activity of the motor cortex, which we are calling is happening because of the mirroring, that should reduce the symptom. That's a straightforward prediction of our model. And how it is done, obviously, we need to kind of think about it. How it could be. There are some. I mean, the mirroring system, as I said, it's a very rich literature. Lots and lots of work has already been done in this one. Obviously, without misophonia in the picture, but I think we have a lot of work has been done, and there is something we can always borrow from the mirroring neuron literature. How, for example, they reduce, and there are a couple of works I cited which could be highly relevant. For example, where the mirror system can be retrained, right? Because the mirror system is automatically active, but then can you retrain it? Is it flexible enough to retrain? And I think the evidence is yes, it is flexible, it can be retrained, it can be changed, and that's a good news. How to devise specific paradigm for misophonia, I think that needs to be worked out in a more misophonia context, actually. So as I said, this prediction is very much clinically relevant. Okay, so this is probably my last slide. Sorry, I've taken a long time, but so the other one is that, well, I think discussion on how we can take it to the future. So I would say the first thing that we have done is there was a data available, but there was no theoretical model. Because in science, at least, if there's no theoretical model, you can't generate hypotheses, where to work on, right? You can't just take, okay, get people with misophonia, play sound and see what is happening. You need to have a theoretical model to generate further hypotheses, which may or may not come out to be true, but you really have to have a theoretical model to work for yourself and also your colleagues to work on. And I guess I would say that uh, ours is the first theoretical model of misophonia. I mean, there are other models, but I think model in a sense which makes predictions, which can be tested, and so on. So I would say that it's the first theoretical model of misophonia, and I would say that it accelerates the progress in understanding brain basis of misophonia. If there's no theoretical basis, people don't take it very seriously. Okay, yeah, you just looked at the brain activity, how it different, and so on, but you need to have a theoretical model which can keep on developing along with the data. So as I said, it generates hypotheses which can be tested. And I hope, my sincere hope is that once this is there, once there's a data, there's a model, and then the big people kind of take notice, and hopefully it gets some place, like a formal recognition. Hopefully, that's the hope, actually.
So, Sukhbinder,
Uh,
sorry.
yeah,
Someone is asking if it's possible to just give more information about retraining the brain. I don't know if you would like to share more information at this point with the
yeah, sure.
audience about training. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'll just come to that. I'll just maybe finish this one and then I'm done. Actually, is that okay?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah, sure. And then measurement of brain activity related to mirroring using, you can, I mean, I use fMRI, but can we use like some more cost-effective method like EEG? And then you can also test the causal role, like okay, so the idea would be that, okay, if I switch off the motor cortex like temporarily, which can be done using like TMS, whether then misophonia symptom would be reduced. So that's the other thing it can test. And yeah, so I think probably we need a collaborative efforts with clinicians, scientists, how to basically put this model to develop effective therapies. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Dr. Kumar, thank you so very much. And Mercedes, thank you so much for answering so many questions. And in fact, Mercedes, I'm going to turn this back over to you to maybe present some of the questions to Sukhbinder that you saw were important. But I just had one question.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple, but so when we talk about anger, people do get confused, and I always like to talk about autonomic nervous system arousal or sympathetic arousal, which you did mention, and I of course asked you this before, but I do want to ask it now in front of everyone. um, what is we know when there is sympathetic nervous system arousal that the amygdala is involved, right? So, what is the connectivity to the amygdala? I mean, you may not know the answer yet, but we know there has to be something
Yeah,
here trigger. I don't want to say triggering, but where that is amygdala involved,
yeah,
and might that fit in the model? Because I think it's an important aspect to fit it into the model, because when we talk about emotions, I feel like, especially with misophonia, we have to understand that emotions include that sympathetic arousal.
yeah. Yeah, so I think there are two parts to your question. One thing is whether there is a amygdala in the picture. Answer is yes. So if you look at the 2017 paper, where we looked at, so in the 2017 paper, NT-insula is like the top. But if you look at how the NT-insula is connected, so where does the NT-insula drive its activity from, right? So is it connected differently? And answer is yes. So there are four nodes. If you look at figure 3 of my 2017 paper, where NT-insula has a stronger connectivity to amygdala
Mm-hmm.
in people with misophonia compared to controls again. It also has connectivity to the brain, they call default mode network, which is the ventromedial prefrontal and also the posterior cingulate back. But so I guess your question related to amygdala, the answer is yes, amygdala is there. But the thing is now sympathetic versus now the anger versus maybe other emotion. So the thing is, I mean, the amygdala obviously people say it's a very emotion related structure. But actually, if you look at the whole data now, the view is slightly changing. Amygdala is, yeah, people just, because sometimes, for example, it is also activated by non-emotional stimuli, like faces, for example. You just take like normal faces, it's active. So whether amygdala is only the emotion-related structure, that is a moot point now. So that's one thing. And the other thing is whether amygdala is sympathetic versus whether it is involved in the sympathetic system. Yes. So it is true that it has a direct connection with the brain stem, where and it kind of activates that one. So probably the increase in the heart rate. Now, for example, when the increase in the heart rate it could be coming via two things. We don't know like which one is coming of that one. So one thing is obviously like the sympathetic system becoming highly active. So the other thing could be the vagal tone, which is the parasympathetic one. So parasympathetic system is with the vagal tone is, and in fact, actually, I have some data which I haven't published. So which also kind of shows that people with misophonia, they have a lower vagal tone in a way that their parasympathetic system, so because the heart rate can be increased if the parasympathetic system is withdrawn, right? Because parasympathetic system lowers the heart rate, but if it is withdrawn, then your heart rate will increase. So now which of the two mechanism, I think we don't know, but there is evidence that at least for people with misophonia, they have a lower heart rate variability, which is a measure of the vagal tone.
So that accounts for the lack of habituation.
Yeah, exactly. So they have a lower heart rate variability, meaning thereby their vagal tone is lower, meaning that it might be that it is the parasympathetic system withdrawal that increases the heart rate. So and it also directly in people with anxiety, for example, in people with anxiety and also depression to some extent, you'll find that all of them, they have a lower heart rate variability, which is an indicative of the vagal tone, basically. So yeah, it could be. I mean, it could be a combination of both of them actually. So I think it's kind of like difficult to say unless you kind of like tease them apart. So it could be that sympathetic is more active, or it could also be parasympathetic is vagal tone is less active.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Mercedes, if that's all right, Mercedes.
Yeah, super. Yeah. I have been trying to answer the questions, but I have selected some of them and also two more questions that just came up.
Sure.
Maybe it's nice to discuss. First of all, one of the audience asked why the trigger sounds tend to be made by family members and people that are closer to us.
That's a very good point, actually.
Yeah, we know that actually people sort of emotional distress and the reactivity to misophonic sounds is pretty much mediated by the social context.
Yeah.
And these are my thoughts that first of all, we tend to get conditioned to people that are closer to us because we listen to them on a daily basis. And also the fact that we do not have to show inhibition toward our family members relative to strangers. So these are two thoughts that I have, but if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think good points, Siri, I think. So just kind of to add that, actually, I mean, let's just take the mirroring model a little bit further. And actually, sorry, whoever raised this question, I think I kind of just briefly mentioned in the discussion section of my paper. Just obviously, we don't have the direct evidence, but I just kind of pointed out that why it starts from a particular family member. And I think my reasoning was taking this mirroring model. Can we understand that? So one thing is that once you say that, okay, the mirroring model is the valid model, it activates your motor cortex. And then what it does, so what is the impact of it? So one thing is that you start mimicking the action of the other person, right? And this mimicking is, we know, and mimicking, by the way, is a very kind of like a highly researched area in social neuroscience, because that's what people think, that we learn from others by mimicking others. And that mimicking happens at multiple levels. It happens at behavioral level. If somebody's doing some action, I might be tempted to do the same action. And there are some work actually I cited in the discussion section of my paper, where, like, there's some experiment. If you ask two people to sit, just facing each other, having dinner or having some food, and you just measure, like, when first person takes a bite or take a spoon bite, basically, and then you measure what time the second person will take to take the bite. And you will find that after some time, they just start synchronizing with each other, right? So the second person gets synchronized with the first one. So it's not just randomly, their actions are not happening randomly. And so this is kind of at a behavioral level. They're also like at a physiological level. So mimicking can happen. People who are closer, like, or like this one, okay, maybe involved in a particular task, for example, their heart rate would get synchronized with each other, or their breathing would get synchronized with each other, right? So this is kind of at a much more physiological level. And then your brain can get synchronized with others. For example, if you can just do a particular task, and if you feel, you can measure the brain activity of the two people, and you'll feel that they also get synchronized. So all I'm saying is that this mimicking, although I'm just kind of referring to the motor cortex here, but if you look at its consequences, and it's kind of like at a multiple level, so that can happen. And but the thing is that this mimicking is not just automatically driven. It's not like, okay, I see the action and I immediately start doing it. No, it is very contextual driven.
Yeah.
It's very contextual driven in the sense that if I'm more likely to mimic the action of my close family member compared to a stranger. If I like somebody, I might be more likely to mimic the action of that person compared to a person who is not at good terms with me, something like that. So all I'm saying is there's a context that kind of drives this one. And at least the evidence is that the mirror system is underlying all of that, right? All of that. So in a way, the mirror system If you take mirror system is driving the mimicking or this behavior emulation, mirror system is not just doing independent things. It is under the control of the context. And that context is the higher order brain areas kind of sitting, the frontal areas, and then so on, which are kind of keeping the mirror system in check whether this action should be kind of mimicking or mimicked or not. So those higher order contextual areas are doing that one. So given that actually we are more likely to mimic, so in a way it sets the context. The context is that family member, and that context probably sets the misophonia in terms of the trigger response actually. So you can understand it completely, or at least within this mirroring model as well, because it is driven by a higher order social brain, which is frontal and anti-insula. I would say anti-insula is also social part of the brain. Actually, it is activated by social context. So I would say that context is basically is driving the mirror system more, and the context is family member compared to stranger, basically. It makes sense?
Yes, and if I could just maybe clarify.
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
Add to that a little bit. You know, when we talk about caregivers and their infants,
Yeah.
the way that infants learn is literally by having their emotions and their expressions mirrored back to them by their caregivers. And that's not necessarily by using mirror neurons, but for a lack of, let me think of another word, reflected back to them. And that's how they learn that who they are and also the boundaries of who they are versus who they're not. So within that model, all of the memory, I would imagine, of that interaction between caregiver and child are going to be some kind of sensitization, I'd imagine, to these mirror neurons. So one implication of this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Sukhbinder, but is that this does not start at age 8, as we have been thinking all along, because that's what people have reported, but this may be something that is starting in infancy.
Yeah, I agree.
In the context of the caregiver and the child or the infant, and then is developing all along and is most, unfortunately, most salient with the context of those who are your family members.
Definitely. Yeah.
Is that a decent explanation?
Yeah, that's pretty clear. Okay, let me go very quickly through the questions. Someone also asked that why some misophonic sufferers also have sexual arousal in response to listening to triggers or hearing the triggers. And as far as I know, we do not really have any data regarding that, but we know based on the subjective data and the published work so far that people that report to have ASMR or autonomous sensory meridian response might have or have reported to have sexual arousal in response to those ASMR triggers. And we know based on our study 2017 that almost half of our participants reporting to have misophonia with different severity also have ASMR. So I believe, but I cannot really think of any scenario at this moment about the neural basis of sexual arousal and misophonia. Do you have any?
Yeah, no, I think I have heard. I have definitely heard about it, but so I guess rather than maybe this more specific, maybe like more general, because sometimes I also at least I've heard or saying people feeling sensation in different parts of the body. Maybe like chest or maybe other different parts of the body they could also feel actually. So I don't know if that kind of also fit within, this sexual arousal would kind of fit within that framework, but I don't know whether it is kind of like more like a negative, well, what kind of like general, whether the stimulus is perceived as bad. So I don't know like how you describe kind of both, is like more of a ASMR or is a misophonia. So it's kind of like a difficult, but I think as for the other bodily sensations like chest feeling or maybe, that's kind of like, that's easy to understand
Yeah.
in a way, because emotions, your body is a theater of your emotions in a way. So all the emotions are expressed in kind of your body. There will be visceral changes and there will also be muscular changes. So I think probably in a way the mirror system is active, but then once the kind of like the emotion, it drives the emotion then kind of starts feeding back to your body, right? So okay, you feel like, okay, again going back to the mirroring model, so there's kind of like perceived interference, you get anger, it kind of changes some sort of physiological setting, and that physiological setting is expressed in the body. So whether the sexual arousal would be a part of that, but I think it needs to be a little bit more specific actually, whether what the subject is perceiving those sound as like ASMR like or misophonia or somewhere in the middle actually.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And someone else also asked if the implication of the study 2021 and its relation with Stephen Porges' safe and sound protocol.
Sorry.
With Stephen Porges' safe and sound protocol.
I can take that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sorry, just please mind that we have like 8 minutes left, maybe less.
Okay.
Just
Yes.
very briefly, and Stephen Porges' protocol was not meant for misophonia. It has not been tested on misophonia, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 people. And I contact them, but I don't think that it was helpful. And if it was, I don't know that there were any lasting results. It's a great protocol for what it was meant for, but absolutely nothing to do with misophonia.
Yeah, cool. And I think the last question, which is very important for now, since we do not really have any randomized clinical trial, at least that meet the standards. Someone asked how we should treat misophonia on a day-to-day basis based on what we have learned so far.
Is it to me? Sorry, question.
Yeah,
Okay,
you are.
Yeah. So, well, I think on a day-to-day basis, I think whether like what are the implications. I mean, as I said, I wouldn't. All we are saying is for example, the mimicking and kind of like maybe something could be done similar to that one, but I haven't tested that. Okay, how effective it would be like. So for someone who haven't really tried that one, I mean, that's like a kind of like a very day-to-day basis. But I'm not sure. I can't think of anything immediately as to what, for example, could be done immediately to get relief. Maybe probably Jennifer, you might have some suggestion actually. Yeah.
Thank you. The problem with the mimicking, and I'm sitting here and I've been thinking about it the whole time, and I've asked a lot of the people that I work with, and most of them said, yeah, and I experienced this myself because, as most of you know, I have misophonia. You mimic, but then as the sound repeats, you have to keep mimicking.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a lasting effect. So there's a little bit of a problem with that.
Yeah.
So as many of you probably have read in the chat, I'm very against anybody using a particular treatment and calling it successful, because there has not been one treatment that is successful. And I know that is disappointing to hear. And believe me, I've been at this for over 25 years. It is very disappointing. But better you should know the truth and wait until there is something. So what I feel strongly right now that we should be what we should be doing for ourselves, for our children, is basically the coping skills, which is a multidisciplinary approach that includes a lot of physical, which is interesting because it does kind of go with the whole motor cortex idea, where we're working on what's called self-regulation. So that you are working on ways to bring in the parasympathetic system, which sort of puts the brakes on fight flight. So learning how to de-escalate the trigger response physiologically, not through talking back to yourself, not through trying to get used to it with exposure, because if that was going to work, then we'd all be fine because we're exposed all the time. So instead, what we can do is educate ourselves about what we know, at least what we know about misophonia, understand what it is. And what I would start to try, and this is, just off the cuff, is motor movements in the mouth, because I've been concentrating a lot with the kids that I work with on gross motor movements. But there may be, which is great because you get the adrenaline out, you're in fight flight, get up, move, when, listen, if you're running, you don't have misophonia. Think about it. If you're in a pool,
that's a good point. It's a good point.
You don't have it. It's pretty amazing.
We have 2 minutes left. So if you have anything to add at the very end of the talk, please say so we can basically have a conclusion.
I just, I guess, one more question. Has TMS helped with, or DBS? Again, with these questions, there has not been anything that has been proven to help.
Especially about DBS, we absolutely have nothing that would support the hypothesis that DBS, whether or not DBS works.
But we're hard at work thinking of things, and thank you. I just want to say thank you so much to Sukhbinder and Mercedes. This, I have to say, this is such a groundbreaking paper, and this is going to allow, rather than repeating how many times can we do CBT differently, how many times can we try exposure therapy and torment ourselves and have it not work? This gives us something to work with finally. And I'm so grateful to Sukhbinder and to Mercedes and to this whole team that did this paper. And the more that you guys can get this paper out there, and if your psychologist says something to you like, I want to try CBT, put this in their face and say, hey, what about this? We need to advocate for ourselves, because people do what they know how to do. They don't do what they don't know how to do because they don't know how to do it. So that's my word of advice as an advocate too. And I just want to, again, thank you so much for your hard work on misophonia. We'd be kind of lost without you.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I think probably you have been very, very generous in praising us. But I think, to be honest, actually, we have learned a lot in my emotion processing, looking at misophonia. It kind of like enriched my understanding of emotion, the way brain processes emotions. So, and as I said, interacting with people, it has been really, really kind of very great learning experience for me. So, well, and thank you very much to you and Shailene for organizing this one, actually. So it has been wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Well, you guys are great. What can I say? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and Shailene and everybody else that were listening to us. It's actually great to get together and exchange some ideas, and we were asked very, very useful questions.
Yeah, you guys were, what an audience. Wow, what great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, thank you all.
Everybody have a great rest of the day, night, wherever you are.
Yeah, it's about 10:30 here. Yeah, that's right. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.